I want to start by thanking all of the participating organizations who co-sponsored this panel discussion today, which includes obviously Not in Our Town Princeton, the Princeton Public Schools, Princeton Civil Rights Commission, Princeton YWCA, the Princeton Family YMCA, the Witherspoon-Jackson Historical and Cultural Society, and the Witherspoon-Jackson Neighborhood Association. In particular, a huge thanks, as always, to the Princeton Public Library for handling registrations and for all of the amazing work that you do in the community, and in particular to Kim Dorman, because she is amazing. Another extra special thank you to Lynda Oppenheim and everyone else in Not in Our Town Princeton who helped organize this discussion. I have a quick announcement to begin with. For those of you in need of childcare, the Burke Foundation Early Childhood Center at the YWCA Princeton is now open and has available enrollment space. The program serves children ages 8 weeks to 6 years old. So for more information, please visit the YWCA Princeton website, as that's one of our co-sponsors. So I'd like to get started. My name is Raisa Rubin-Stankiewicz. I am a board member for the organization Not in Our Town Princeton and a recent Princeton High School graduate, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion. So before we begin, I just wanted to quickly review the format of tonight's event. We're going to have in advance about 90 minutes of discussion on some questions that were decided by the organizers in advance, and we're going to have 20 minutes, at least 20 minutes for discussion of questions from the audience, which you might be able to notice you can submit through the chat at any point throughout the discussion. We will try to ask as many of the audience questions as we possibly can. We might not have time for all, obviously. And the way that this is going to work is that because we have an amazing group of 12 panelists, and they are going to indicate to me by raising their hand when they wish to speak, and we're going to and from there we're going to have our discussion. So with that, I am very excited to introduce our amazing panelists, and I will try to make it as quick as possible because we have 12 of them. So Geoffrey Allen graduated from Princeton High School in 2019 and is currently a sophomore at the College of Wooster. While at Princeton High School, he was involved in the Ridgeview Woods program and later in the Minority Student Achievement Network. And over the summer, he took part in the petition movement to rename the middle school. So Moji Ayodele is a junior at Princeton High School and one of the leaders of the club CARE, which stands for Cultural and Racial Equity, which is a social and racial justice group that uses conversations and activities to talk about injustice. We have the amazing Dr. Joy Barnes-Johnson, who has been a teacher in the Princeton Public Schools since 2007 and co-teaches the racial literacy with Ms. Manhart in addition to her chemistry classes. We have Cecilia Birge, who became an assistant principal at Princeton High School in July. Previous to that, she was a teacher of mathematics and special education and has 4 children, 2 at Princeton High School and 2 recent graduates. She is an active community volunteer in the Asian American community, and before she became an educator, she was the first Asian American woman elected as mayor in New Jersey. We also have Lynda Dodd, who served as the president of the Community Park PTO and now serves on the board of the Princeton Children's Fund and the 101 Fund, and has been serving this year on a special equity subcommittee of the Board of Education to talk through and plan the introduction and implementation of a racial equity impact assessment process in the Princeton Public Schools, and also is a parent of a 4th grader at Community Park. Marceline Du Bose is the founder and lead equity specialist of the Due East Educational Equity Collaborative and authored the 2018 Princeton Equity Audit Report. I'm so sorry, this is really long. Eli Edelman is one of the co-founders of the Restorative Coalition, which is a Princeton-based youth activism organization which focuses on restorative and racial justice. And they're also a non-binary activist who has served on the Youth Advisory Board for the Transgender Youth Forum of New Jersey and currently a junior at Princeton High School. Barry Galasso is the interim superintendent of the Princeton Public Schools and has been in public education for close to 5 decades in urban, suburban, and rural school districts. Juan Polanco graduated from Princeton High School in 2013 and is his primary focus is on finance and is interested in affordable housing matters in Princeton. Shirley Satterfield is her family has been Princeton residents since the late 1800s. She attended the Princeton schools during the time of segregation education and graduated from Princeton High School. While a student at Bennett College, she joined the Greensboro Four to march and join in the sit-ins at Woolsworth and Greensboro, New Jersey. She taught at many different school districts, and if I went through her entire bio, it would take pretty much the rest of the evening. But she also was a guidance and college counselor at Princeton High School and is currently the historian of African American life in Princeton and the president of the Witherspoon Jackson Historical and Cultural Society. Keith Wailoo has been a parent in the Princeton Public Schools District for 10 years, and his children graduated in 2017 and 2020. He is a professor at Princeton whose teaching and research focuses on equity issues in health, medicine, and society. And last, but certainly not least, is Brianna Silva, who graduated from Princeton High School in 2018 and is particularly focused on equity for Latinx and English language learners, students, and families. So even though that was very painful for all of you to sit through, the point is that we have an amazing panel and I am so excited for our discussion today. So I believe we can get started with our first question. So for the sake of framing our discussion today, we are going to begin by asking if you can identify one aspect or component of a racially progressive school. And whoever would like to start can just raise their hand or unmute themselves. Yes, Geoffrey, go ahead.
Well, I feel like to start the discussion, I think we should really focus on equity, as discussed before and discussed again. True, progressive reform will really come with equity amongst all students, being able to have the same opportunities and participate in them. I feel like that's a big factor when it comes to advanced placement or any other types of classes, especially in high school, and just making sure that there's an even distribution of students partaking in each activity at their own pleasure, of course. Yeah.
Moji, go ahead.
So I would like to add on that, obviously, yeah, we love the racial literacy, how we have that in all the schools now. But to create more of a racially progressive school, I think in all of our classes, we should be learning about, of all cultures, African, Black, Asian, everything like that, in all of our classes, and be learning about people who have taught, or not taught, but have invented or are in that realm of science, history, and all that.
Okay, Marceline?
I think I was thinking about your question from a precursor to equity or a foundational ingredient to equity. So that there's a lot of indicators of equity and outcomes of equity, but what are the ingredients that are required to create that? And there are a number of them, but one that's coming to my mind that's really important is representation. So what is the representation of your teaching staff? What's the representation of your engaged parent groups? What's the representation on your board? What's the representation in different courses? Representation is a key ingredient to feeding the decisions that are required to happen to create equity. So that was something I was thinking about.
That's a great answer. Juan?
Yeah, I think just going off from that, I think, we can't have an honest conversation about an equitable school when we don't have a conversation about housing, especially in Princeton. We all know that, exclusionary zoning, lack of affordable housing can be a predetermined for letting someone into a public school system. And so, and I think I'm bringing this point up because as someone who was born in Guatemala, as someone who spent 2 years in Trenton in the public school system, and as someone who was granted access to the Princeton public education system by means of affordable housing, I think it's important to have an honest conversation about the type of people who live in our town and what the type of people who are actually excluding as a result of lack of affordable housing, and also the lack of and also as a result of the exclusionary zoning that can be very can provide the lack of inclusion in the public education systems, specifically in Princeton. So that's I would like to chime in.
Okay, Dr. Galasso? I think you're still muted.
How about now?
Perfect.
Perfect, great. Picking up on that theme, in my experience, it's been recognition and commitment. And I think Princeton has gone a long ways towards the recognition. And now it's time for the commitment throughout the K-12, pre-K to 12, the implementation of a pre-K, K, and 1 literacy program that we just put in place for our kids. The opportunity for the Board of Education to provide one-to-one devices, and for us to secure a grant to allow connectivity for 175 homes, in addition to 75 hotspots for people through Comcast and T-Mobile. So from an equity standpoint, commitment to providing everything that's necessary for kids to have a level playing field, because public education should be that level playing field. And it has to be a commitment of staff, and it has to be an ongoing commitment that builds momentum. And once that momentum is built, I've watched in other districts that I've been in, the amazing things that have been accomplished, because residents are looking for results. They're looking for deliverables. How do we identify? How do we close the achievement gap? These are things that I think are important. And that's what I mean by when I talk about commitment and action. The recognition is there. It's now time for that action and deliverables, so it builds a momentum, and the entire faculty, community, and students are engaged in moving towards that equity piece. But the board has to make the commitment, and the board has made the commitment to providing whatever resources are necessary to move from recognition to action.
Okay. Did anyone else want to speak in response to this first? Okay. Keith, Dr. Wailoo, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick observation about leadership being really central in whatever commitments a school system or a school system endorses. A school takes its cues from leaders like Dr. Galasso. I think a progressive school will depend on having progressive leaders, leadership that champions diversity and inclusion and equity and anti-racism at all levels, which would involve the student community, its teachers, its administrators, and also in its curriculum, and that's committed to racial literacy, not just as a one-time thing, but as an ongoing one. And we're at a particularly important time in Princeton, where we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Galasso with us for this year, but we're also working towards new leadership. And I think you can't really have a racially progressive school without a leader and a set of leaders who are committed to that undertaking.
Yes, Shirley, do you want to go ahead? I think you're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Introduce students to the history of their race because the past shapes a more equitable future. And as William Faulkner says, the past is never dead, it never even passed. So I think they need a history of their race.
Okay, yes, Eli. And really quickly before we start, just for all the speakers, would you mind keeping yourselves unmuted for the sake of this this portion? It's for some reason it's making me have to unmute one of each of you individually, and so I just wanted to make that clear. Sorry, go ahead, Eli.
I think this was mentioned a couple of times, but I think a really big component should be a focus on communication and conversation between community members, teachers, administration, but I think especially between students and teachers and administration. I think that a student voice is a voice that is often less paid attention to, and I think it's very crucial to stepping towards a progressive school.
All right. Yes, Brianna, go ahead.
Awesome. So yeah, just what other people were saying really resonated with me in terms of representation. I was kind of just looking through the room right now, and I was like, it's always thinking like who's at the table, who's being represented, who is not at the table. And I see a lot of groups of people not represented at this table, as I'm sure you guys may see or notice as well. So that's always something to take into consideration. Why are they not at the table? What is preventing them from being at the table? And how can we bring them to the table? I also think in terms of students are so important. At the end of the day, like it all goes through a chain and it affects the students the most because they are the product of everything. So it's really important to listen to students and have that open avenue. So yeah.
Okay. I think that unless there's anyone else who really, really wants to speak to this point, I think it makes sense to move on to the next question. So I have another quick note before we do that. I'm really sorry to ask this, but could audience members who aren't panelists, could you turn your video off? Because just for the sake of, it's a long description, but if you're able to do that, that would make things a little bit easier. So thank you so much. So the next question, I apologize for all the technical difficulties again. The next question, because it seems like we're really getting into Princeton, what specifics, I think we're going to start with the superintendent on this one, but what specific steps have the Princeton Public Schools taken recently to move towards racial progress and equity in general? And where is there still work that needs to be done? So Dr. Galasso, would you mind kicking off this portion of the discussion? And you're muted currently, but I think.
Okay, it wouldn't let me unmute myself, so we're in good shape now. I'll keep that off so we don't question. Well, I think the Princeton Public Schools, just being here for 3 months, some of the things that we have started to implement in the Princeton Public Schools, I think are turning in principles into action plans. For example, today or yesterday was the 30th of September, and I've asked every elementary principal, middle and high school principal to submit a plan to me on how they're going to identify students in their schools and come up with plans with their individual faculties to build supports for kids. It's not enough to identify kids. It's important for faculties and staff to come together to build supports and to present a plan on how we're going to help these youngsters close that achievement gap. And what we would like them to do is every 30, 60, and 90 days report out to central administration what the achievement is, what the successes are, what resources they need, because the plan has to be specific to the elementary schools. And it has to be that commitment that I talked about, the buy-in between our faculty and staff and a partnership with parents. So not only is it a plan to identify the youngsters who are not achieving at the levels that we want them to achieve, in order for them to compete and to be equitable, we have to be able to provide them the supports. I've watched this in a number of school districts that I've been superintendent in. I'll share one quick story with you. In an urban center like Camden, New Jersey, which was one of the poorest cities in the country, I watched the faculty and staff in a school of 1,000 kids close the achievement gap in 2 years by building supports, tutorial programs, engaging parents, and having everyone work as a team to close that achievement gap and make kids successful. That can happen in Princeton, and I think that's what we're committed to. In addition to that, I talked about the one-to-one initiative. I also wanted to talk about our supports. We talked about connectivity, but you mentioned earlier in the presentation, we also wrote a grant and were successful with an anonymous funder to provide childcare and to provide tutorial supports at the YMCA and the YWCA. We were able to obtain 90 scholarships for parents who qualify. So I would encourage anyone who's listening tonight that needs childcare to please contact Valerie at the central office for the details of how to qualify for that free childcare. So a plan to close the achievement gap, good devices connectivity, childcare and tutorial programs for our kids being paid for by a grant, the implementation of a pre-K, and 1 literacy program developed by our supervisors and specifically Keisha Carrington, in place in September, I think is a great start for the Princeton School District. I'm not going to elaborate any longer because Dr. Joy is on the call, and so are others to talk about the middle and the high school programs that have been put in place for this particular year. But I think that commitment that I talked about earlier is there now. And we're anxious to show the community that we can deliver success. And I think once that momentum is built, I think our students are going to play a huge role because they're going to want more and more success. And I think they'll continue to challenge the faculty and staff. And I believe that's the momentum piece with the great work that Marceline has done with the staff for the last 2 or 3 years. That's all set. Now the question becomes, how do we implement and how do we foster the kinds of programming that can deliver results and that the community can be confident that the Princeton School District can deliver.
Thank you so much, Dr. Galasso. I don't want to does anyone else want to speak a little bit to it? I think yes. Lynda, would you like to go ahead?
There is so much work being done nationwide to reduce the opportunity gap. And I think many people would prefer that leaders refer to opportunity gaps rather than achievement gaps, given the prevalence of racism in our society and its impact on public schools. One of the things that I also proposed along with racial equity impact assessments, which is a tool to help to get from A to B. I think there's commitment to get to B, but there is, at every stage, a major decision is made that will require resources and trade-offs. And so I think that to avoid blind spots in decision-making, an equity impact assessment process that it goes at every level, from the board to the district administration and to the principals at the schools talking about their budgets, would help get from A to B. There's also new databases that will help identify other school districts who are moving fast with fewer resources to close opportunity gaps. But I did want to say that about the opportunity gaps, but I also wanted to say as a white parent on this panel that a lot of the work has to be done by white parents to think about where their privileges are intersecting with people's disadvantages. So for example, in other locations like in Brooklyn, New York, there's a public school in Brooklyn where white parents decided they were going to advocate to close the tracking system for the gifted and talented program. And they pushed for a waiver because this is a huge issue in New York City. So that, I think, is a racially progressive move. And it's not, you know, something that you'll see commonly. It requires a culture shift. So those are just a few things, but I do think Princeton would benefit from looking externally. And, you know, I really hope with the superintendent search, it will be evidence-based, looking for leaders. You know, there are these groups of reform-minded superintendents who are in racially progressive districts now with good results in Baltimore and all over the country. So this is a moment for Princeton to put in place someone at the top who can help direct this new era in our schools, and I hope that happens.
Thank you so much, Lynda. Yes, Marceline, go ahead.
I'll be really quick because I just want to connect with something Lynda said. And Lynda, I want to thank you for like highlighting opportunity gaps, and then you went from there to talk about how white parents engage with schools, and language is always growing and changing. And so recently, new language I've also heard paired with opportunity gaps is opportunity hoarding. And
yes.
there's opportunity hoarding happening, and undo that as well. So it's not directly on your question, Raisa, but I thought since that came up, I would share that with the room.
No, that was very, very helpful. And I'm going to take it to, I'm so sorry, Dr. BJ, I had not initially seen your hand. Please take it away.
Well, I was going to underscore Lynda's point and then draw in what Marceline said and tie it back to Geoffrey. The reality that Geoffrey and Eli and Moji and Juan and Brianna are students in this conversation sort of underscores the point that students are thirsty to have more opportunities to not only be seen, but to be valued, to be supported in their development. And so what Juan said, we have to deal very honestly with systemic oppression, which includes access to resources in housing, in food security, in technologies like what Dr. Galasso has mentioned, but then also creating enough supports so that beyond the school, we allow students to develop scholar identity.
Yes.
And so it's an entire shift in pedagogy that is an empowerment pedagogy that deals head on with power structure. So to Lynda's point and to Shirley's point, knowing your history as a foundation allows you as both a person of color, Black, Indigenous, Latino, immigrant, or born in the United States, you need to understand that hierarchies erase you. So knowing your history and being able to connect to those histories allow you to not only get organized, but to sort of fortify yourself and be connected to resources that will allow you to continue to advance. That is something that we have in our community in Princeton that we have not fully taken advantage of because we tokenized so many of our students and so many students of color. So when we get to a place where opportunity hoarding stops, and because clearly we have a few token groups, people that do get resources, that do get attention, but at the end of the day, how can we again eliminate so much disparity? And that is the necessary equalizing that we need. I'm always challenged by questions that don't directly address the real caste that exists in our community. We have class issues that must be addressed and that keep us focused on race without contemplating intersections of race with other really important things. And so the idea of being progressive must allow us to unpack the kinds of focal points that we put solely on race and do not deal with things like immigration status, languages spoken in the home, opportunities outside of whatever we find normative, and allow more people not only to advance, but to just be equal. And so that's always a challenge. Racially progressive education has to deal with caste as well.
Mm-hmm.
So as usual, when I'm talking with Dr. BJ, you just jumped forward to like 3 other questions down the line in like one answer, which is very much the typical experience. So I do want to come back to talking about, obviously, I think it's so important that we talk about what's going on with the Princeton Public Schools, but it does seem like there's kind of, there was sort of a jump to looking at other, with Lynda's response, looking at other models, right? So there's another question in this discussion that maybe we might want to jump down to, which is about sort of what you have encountered. Have you ever encountered a school district that you would label as racially progressive, and sort of what, if so, what sort of made you feel that way? Because I think you're right. I think starting with sort of examples of what we're looking at might be a really, really good way. And then we do have another question sort of down the line to talk a little bit about racial progress and the intersectionality. And I think that really, that should be interweaved throughout this entire discussion, but absolutely, I think we should get to that in the discussion soon. So I think maybe we should start by jumping down to the part about, have you ever encountered or observed a school district that you would label as racially progressive? And if so, what made you feel that way? Do we have any volunteers?
Well, I recently invited some people to join me on a call with Kindred, an organization in the DC public schools that is dealing with this issue of the parent community. And, you know, I was coming off a time of service with the PTO, so I was interested in this. And I also, you know, after the summer and the news in Princeton about, you know, our community, I was thinking, well, what are things we could do to improve the climate, you know, among parents, so that every parent feels welcome in our schools. And they've done a lot with this Kindred approach that has facilitated small groups. And I know Riverside PTO is doing something similar with the Talking Circle. That's a great initiative, but Kindred brings in a professional, and it's made a difference. So there's gentrification in the public schools in DC. And so there are, you know, white parents moving in who have their own ideas. It's a lot like the podcast that inspired today's talk. And, you know, they did impact studies. So I think the Urban Institute did a study of the impact of these groups. And by all accounts, it was helpful for everybody. So something like that, I think, is, you know, unique. I did research to see what is being done to help parents feel more engaged with the school. And you know, there are other programs. I mean, there's not a school district that does everything perfectly, but there are other programs that I admire a lot, like one called Building Assets, Reducing Risks, which sets high expectations for all students. Building assets is just as much a focus as thinking about, you know, all of the deficits. You know, they avoid deficit language with this program. They use real-time data tracking to follow this. They don't report test scores with these categories of race. They look at intersectional groupings, you know, so it's personalized, and the teachers come together to speak about students all the way through. So a model like that, I think, helps students advance academically and personally, and you know, they get a lot more attention from the teachers. So that to me is like my ideal. If I was going to wave a magic wand and deal with opportunity gaps, it would be through something like that, because they have a motto: same teachers, same, you know, school, different results. You know, so it's a systems approach to not spend a ton of money, but do something differently to help students.
Thank you so much, Lynda. Yes, Keith, please go ahead.
Quick comment about this. One is that I actually think that a racially progressive school, or a school that's devoted to equity, you know, it's more like a process rather than a state of being. that you have to commit yourself to work constantly towards these goals. It's like a couple years, many years ago, one of our presidents said, you know, we don't want peace in the Middle East, we want a peace process. You have to keep working at it day and day and day, one day after the other. So how you put systems in place to make sure that progressive values are upheld and championed and promoted and rewarded, that's really, to me, the challenge. And I have maybe a personal reflection. So I'm a immigrant kid. We came to this country when I was 8. I grew up in the New York City public school system in the 1970s. And the one most memorable experience I had wasn't with a racially progressive school, but it was a teacher who somehow convinced the school to not have us spend the year learning about English teacher, parsing sentences, but to let us write. Just like short stories and analyze song lyrics and talk about these things. And I still think about this guy as doing something truly special, not just for me, but for a lot of my other classmates. And so I think that, you know, what you need is a commitment to a system that lets students unleash their creativity and their excellence and not judge them purely by, I mean, to this day, I still don't know, you know, a lot of like the kinds of things I should have learned in 5th grade English. So, you know, there's a downside to it, but the upside is that like I learned to love writing. And it has sustained me for my entire life after that. So, you know, having leaders who let that kind of experimentation go and let go sometimes of the like, well, you have to check the box to make sure that we cleared these particular hurdles. So that's just my own personal reflection on, progressive teaching.
Moji, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I think like we should revamp like the education to like better like or fit like the modern day student, like use like cultures and teaching like maybe hip hop or sneakers and like stuff like that. Like we need to like the modern student now is very different from the modern student from a few years ago, and I feel like we all learn a little differently. So if we use like social media, stuff like that to learn, I feel like that could be like a racially progressive way of learning, teaching. Yeah.
All right, Dr. BJ, yes, go ahead.
So very quickly, I think, again, to echo what Keith and Moji are saying, this idea that one of the ways that we can look outside of Princeton would be to look toward Trenton. We are in the point in our curriculum writing as a state where we have adopted LGBTQ curriculum. We have just ratified our standard statements, and they're not actually going to be set to be adopted until next year. I say we leverage the authority that comes with a Princeton brand to go to Trenton and say, this youth culture, racially literate classrooms is a policy that needs to be created, and then supports put in place so that every school in the state of New Jersey has programs and infrastructural support for it. Representation would include hiring more teachers of color across the band, the spectrum of diversity that exists. So when you do that, understand that teachers will bring that art that they have and create interdisciplinary lessons and so on. Has to be tied to teacher evaluation, program evaluation, and ultimately we will transform not just Princeton schools, but the educational experience in the state. I think we focus too narrowly on Princeton. Not one, but we. If we change, it won't be so weird for other places.
Yes, Eli, go ahead.
So I moved to Princeton when I was going into 9th grade, but before that I was in the WWP school district, specifically on the like Dutch Neck Village Community Middle School, and then if I stay at High School North track, there's like 2 tracks of it. So at least in my side of the district, I looked at the statistics, and these are the recent ones. I would say we were more the school was more racially progressive, but it was definitely more racially diverse. 70% of our population were Asian, identified as Asian. That's Eastern Asian, Southern Asian, just so many different cultures. It was a big mix. And 9% of the school identified as either African or African American. I couldn't find like specific numbers of the rest, but I just know that I was exposed to so many cultures so young. And it's crazy how the town over, it's West Windsor, and here could be so different in the experience that I had growing up, where like when I was in elementary school, we would have culture day where all the different families would come in and just bring food, and we'd do dancing, and there would be a henna station, and it'd be amazing. So I think that a big thing is getting people to share their cultures. And I think that's a big step towards a racially progressive school, is having it not be so separated in the way that we eat, the way that we interact, and our music and everything like that. I grew up eating dosas for breakfast and making homemade dumplings. And I think that really exposed me so much to other cultures. And I think it would be really amazing and racially progressive if schools could help expose everybody to each other's cultures.
Okay. Yes, Brianna.
So I guess one thing I want to mention that I've seen at other schools, I am currently in Richmond, Virginia, that I didn't really see growing up in the Princeton Public School District, was really a focus on how do you cater to parents that English isn't their primary language. And I've really appreciated like resources, like for instance, something as simple as having the school website be offered in every single language, like having like some type of thing that has like a Google Translate or whatever it is, so that parents can easily go on there and just choose whatever language they feel most comfortable with, so that they have access to that information. And then also having access to that type of stuff in like guidance counseling, like offices, like all those papers should be translated in different languages. All the things in the front desk should be translated to different languages. And there should also be people, I specifically work with a lot of Latinx communities and families. And I always see there's a lack of counselors, of people in administration, of people at the front desk, teachers who are knowledgeable on how to teach people who English isn't their primary language. And so I think something that I've really admired of other schools is that they have workshops that for their teachers on what are the best proven methods on how to teach English language learners, which I think is so important, because if you look at the research, like they're the subpopulation of students that are suffering the most right now, and they are dropping out the most in high schools. So it's really important to think of and bring up in the conversation. And so I'll probably be talking about that for a lot of the rest of the talk, but I just really am passionate about it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think if everyone's all right with it, I think we should move on to the next question, which I think we've had a really, really great discussion so far about sort of what are the components of a racially progressive school? What does a racially progressive school look like? I think now it might be really helpful to talk about some of the barriers, if you are all up for it. So our first question is, what are the barriers to creating and sustaining racially progressive schools? And you can answer that specifically to Princeton if you would like, or you can answer it for the state, nationwide, whichever track you want to sort of take.
Well, I mean, I think the obvious response is alienation. You know, alienation on the parts of students who experience racism in schools and on the part of their parents and families. You know, once a student and families disengage from the school or feels disrespected, or feels there's a breach of trust in the way some conflict was resolved publicly, I don't think they come back easily. And there aren't very many ways in public schools for there to be channels of communication where the family or the student wouldn't fear reprisals. So in my view, anonymous reporting should be in every school district. Princeton may be the last school district in the country to implement it, but it's free through Sandy Hook Promise, so you can do it at low expense. And there should be climate surveys done more regularly in the Princeton Public Schools. That's commonly done at other school districts. Princeton University could help with those, just to design the survey well. But I think that feedback that's anonymous is important to gauge, what's being done.
Can I jump in? I think curriculum harm is one of those reasons. If a child shows up and cannot access the content because they're embarrassed or being silenced, being told that their understanding or their lack of understanding is invalid or not worth pursuing, that's curriculum harm. Mm-hmm. So if they're being made to read titles that are pejorative in every way, that erase them, that don't see them or allow them to be seen when they're not given options, when they're, so that's all I have to say. Racially progressive schools provide not only entry into a classical world, which is code for white curriculum, European, Eurocentric curriculum, but given opportunities to actually find themselves and or make choices that will allow them to take from that buffet, but feast on that which will feed their soul. A lot of the reasons why people don't want to show up, why they drop out, is because, as Brianna said, they have lost their happy and school has become a chore. And so a racially progressive school works at all costs to make sure that joy is maintained and it doesn't spirit murder the children. It allows them to dream big dreams and create a pathway that may not look like AP class. So the opportunity gap, the thing that we place as most valuable in a high school curriculum, may not be what I want to do. And they're made to feel badly about that. And so I think we need to address that too.
Ms. Birge, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. Thank you. So I want to go back to the last question a little bit. I have to say that Princeton is the school where I feel is the most progressive place I've been to. And a large part is because whether as a teacher or as a parent or now as a new administrator, I've always felt that I have been given the permission to even just talk about race and equity. And I've lived and worked in other schools that these topics are not even mentioned. And the fact that Juan pointed out the close connection between education and housing. I mean, for a young person like him who recently graduated from school, that by itself is incredibly impressive. So I want to recognize that. And secondly, I also agree with Dr. BJ that our curriculum, especially after this pandemic or starting from this pandemic, needs a revolution. The incremental changes that we have traditionally adopted, I think we need to throw that out of the window and really begin to look much more profoundly of how we teach not just racial literacy, but also economics. You know, I think there's a lot more about economics that we can talk about than what AP curriculum can offer, and the depth is entirely different. So, I also think that what we do well at Princeton schools, at least at the high school that I'm most familiar with, where my own children have a lot of experiences, is we do serve our students well. We really try. All the administrators, all the teachers, we try incredibly hard to serve the students. I feel where we fall short is there isn't enough safe space for our kids. That's, I think, an important topic for conversation. And another point I want to point out is that I don't know, I'm not smart enough to do this. I think Dr. BJ, I'm sure she has a lot to offer. I think the entire narrative of how we look at race relations, how educators deal with it, should be changed. I, as an Asian American woman, very often feel I'm left out in the Black versus white dialogue. I think it was Dr. Wailoo who talked about, it's a process. The way I talk to my children, right, some may agree or some may disagree, is what is my role? What is my commitment in that process, regardless of our skin color? In my opinion, whether you're Black or white or brown or pink and green, we all have the color of water. We can, we work that out. It's a process that we have discovered by ourselves. What is the color of water? So I think that from that point, we can take this movement beyond the schools. If we really are talking about this at the high school level, we lost that battle long time ago. So, but if we know what our role is in advancing this cause and what our personal commitment is, that's how we take this beyond the school door, beyond Princeton, and beyond Mercer County. That's it.
Brianna?
I just wanted to, I guess, add on to that. Something I was just thinking about in terms of like one thing that, wow, I already lost my thought. But anyways, I'll bring up a new thought. But one thing I was thinking about was the fact that even with like principals, I wish that sometimes when I was called to the principal's office, like it was just for them to talk to me, just to be like, how are you? How's your day? And not just for like, oh, you got in trouble for this, or you didn't go to class, or whatever happened. I mean, they never told me that, but still. It's just like, I wish there was that relationship, and I hope that could be really built within students so that they know they don't have to like hold it or pent it inside, that they can go to the vice principals or assistant principals, there you go, and then principals and whoever it may be. But also, I guess I want to build on my experience as a student to also show that as well. I always felt that, I guess my experience was that Princeton High School specifically wasn't as progressive. I seriously was like, even with this whole like going through the racial literacy stuff and all that, it only how I viewed it, it only happened because of so many racial incidents that occurred and that people spoke out. That's when the trigger really happened, even though it had been in the talks for years. Why was it not implemented until there was a big, like it was on the news, it was on the media, like why didn't that happen? And that's something that I still take issue with, and I still think is a problem, to address that there's so many underlying issues that certain people in administration were aware of, but it was never brought up, and no plans were ever followed through until students really spoke out. I think, as we see with the petitions, students are frustrated and angry, and they don't think that they can go to administration, or they think the only way they can be heard is by shouting. And so I think there's still a lot more to do to make PHS progressive.
Eli, yes?
I think Restorative Coalition has worked with especially PHS administration a lot to try to implement things in the school. We were actually working on a reporting system that we've now built into the, I don't know if we're still calling it the Restorative Council that we're currently working on. But I think one of the biggest barriers that we've run into, when we do talk to the administration, is just the bureaucracy of it all and how long everything takes. The process is too long, and it's unnecessarily long, because you can be trying to get something done and it will take months. And then what do you do in those months? This is things that need to be done now. I know the statement of values that just recently got presented at PHS had been finished since around May or June. And we went through a whole process of getting it approved and being told it will be in the handbook. But then we had to redo the process over the summer. And it was a whole process. So I think the fact that it has to go through so many levels and so many committees and all these things without, these are students talking to you and saying, this is what needs to be done. How can we do it quickly and effectively? I think it just needs to be, I think students need to be listened to, and that needs to be taken into more consideration, is the fact that, yes, sometimes it takes a long time to do something well, but what can you implement immediately while you're working on the long term?
So really quickly, before I go to someone else, Eli, do you want to talk for 2 seconds about the Restorative Council? Because I'm not sure everybody necessarily knows what you're referring to when you mention that.
So the Restorative Council is something that Restorative Coalition is currently working with the school on creating. And it is going to be a council of diverse students trying to get as many people from as many identities and minorities and marginalized groups as we can possibly get to, well, it can't be too big, unfortunately, to create a council that will deal with instances of bias and that will advise administration on how to deal with like our code of conduct and how to deal with instances of bias, and we will hear out students' problems. And at the moment, we're still trying to work on defining exactly what we'll do, because again, bureaucracy, working on what powers the students will be able to have. But the hope is that it will give minority students more of a voice so that all of us can be heard. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Just wanted to make sure. Is there anyone else who wanted to speak to this point in particular? Geoffrey, yes?
Yes. I just want to ask I guess, rhetorical question here about the audience in this current Zoom meeting and who is really paying attention to what we're discussing about, and what do the students know about what we're trying to do, and do they even know that like there is even an attempt to make a more racially progressive or even equitable school? I feel like that's also a barrier itself. I feel like communication between the community and also the students is a big factor to consider. Like as Raisa, you mentioned, and you asked Eli, what was the restorative circle, to preface, because I'm sure that not everyone here knows about that. And I feel like that would also go a long way in not only boosting the self-esteem of students, but also just open more dialogue for more discussion about what can be done, instead of waiting for reactions such as scandals or racial incidents that happen.
Sure, Eli, very quickly. You're muted.
Yeah, apparently I'm having some mic trouble, so I will talk very loudly. But I really did want to comment on that. Is you're right, students don't really know what's going on. And there's a severe lack of miscommunication with the student body, that students don't know that other students are running these things, like the restorative, or I guess we called them healing circles that occurred, were a collaboration with multiple groups, including the Restorative Coalition, which is made up of mostly PHS students and PHS alumni. And there was a lack of communication with the student body. And I'll talk about the statement of values with a friend, and they'll be like, what are you talking about? And there's just the issue where we need to talk about these things even before there's a finished product. And yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who wanted to comment on this particular question, or should we move on? Yes, Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, one quick comment, which is that, you know, one of the disappointments that I had in watching the way the controversy around the video was handled this summer is you look to your school leaders to not just kind of articulate why they disapprove of something, but also what values they want to uphold. Sort of what, and so what I would say is one of the elements of a racially progressive school is one where you don't have to wonder what the values are of equity, inclusion, and engagement with difference is. That you shouldn't have to like wonder what the school and its administrators or its school stand for. It should really be clear because it should be articulated and championed. It should be the basis on which, you know, awards are given in the school. It should be that those are the kinds of things that a progressive school should be upholding as the ideal for its students, right? So, and I guess to me, without that, what happens is scandals happen, and then you get the "we disapprove," or "we disapprove, we can't do anything about it," or and so on, and it just doesn't generate any kind of positive message. What's really out there in the conversation is like bad behavior and the inability of the school to do anything about it. And it's like rinse and repeat. It just happens again 2 years later. So building progressive education, building a progressive school involves like repeatedly upholding positive community values and values of citizenship. It's issues like, you know, how do you like if someone is engaging in insensitive behavior, whether it's a teacher or a classmate, what's the right thing to do? You know, like those are sort of values. So it goes a little bit beyond racial literacy to upholding really positive and promoting positive values. So.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, Moji, and then I do want to move on from this question soon, but go ahead.
Okay, just to go off what he was saying, like, I feel our administration, everyone needs to start taking a little more ownership and leadership over certain situations. Like, for example, as we all know, the Pop Smoke song, like, I felt like they didn't take the right, like, there was no apology in the end. There was no, or that I know of, and it felt like it was very kind of, like there was lots of conversation, but in the end it was kind of swept under the rug. And I feel like we should implement policies to where when situations like this happen, the right steps are taken forward to where these processes slow down and we come to more of a common ground.
So it seems like we're discussing a little bit about a particular incident in this case. I wasn't sure if either Dr. Galasso or if Marceline, if either of you wanted to speak. Dr. Galasso, if you wanted to speak to the incident, or Marceline, I know you wrote a certain article over the summer that might shed some interesting light on this discussion, but no pressure either way, but just let me know.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it, but actually, so I did write an article this summer because just quick background besides what Raisa did to introduce me. I work across the country with a lot of districts all over the country. And this summer was a very busy summer of like harmful, hurtful things that were happening in schools. And I started to notice a very distinct pattern of how school communities were responding to that and not responding to it, and kind of, as Keith and Moji mentioned, then kind of like a rinse and repeat, right? And so I wrote an article that outlined like literally step by step probably what would happen. And then reactions or responses that the school district should take. My role primarily is working with school administrators, and so that was the lens from which I wrote the piece. Not to say that there aren't many things that students should do and the whole school community should do, but that particular piece, that's what it was related to. But it really was about what's already been elevated and highlighted here, particularly by Keith and Moji, about slowing down, connecting, looking at our codes of conduct, definitely like elevating the perspectives, needs, and repairing the harm for those who have been harmed, for you kind of pacify those other people who may feel like that they're involved in the situation. So I can share it with you, Raisa, but or share it with you to share with the group if you want. But it might be informative and instructive in this case, potentially, just based on the unfortunate like predictability of all of it. It probably feels really unique, and it's horrible everywhere that it happens and should not happen. And then the other horrible thing about it is how predictable it is. So just offer that up as a resource.
Okay. And I don't want this to be a focus of the discussion. Dr. Galasso, was there anything you would want to say, or are you all right?
I'll just say this, that you know, I've had personally an opportunity to engage with many community members with regard to this particular issue with the school administration and how it occurred, when it occurred, and what our responsibilities and roles are. I think we learn from every incident that occurs. Actually, I think when we move forward through the initiatives we're taking, they're measurable, they're in place. This is a commitment that we have to doing things. I think the students who spoke have a you know, that's their perspective is important. We need to take that into consideration, and we need to be able to articulate the school's position, when it can be involved, when it cannot be involved, and when it is involved and there are violations, then we will act swiftly, quickly. I also agree with the student with regard to the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy should never be an excuse for changing behavior or changing process or changing policy that are important to students. So I'm happy to hear this tonight, because when I meet with the administration over the next couple of weeks, I don't want things to take months to change. We can move quicker than that. We're not that large. One of the beauties of having the school system with 4,000 students and 800 staff members, it's not 150,000 students and a bureaucracy. We should be able to shift and move very fluid and quicker than was described by the students who spoke tonight. So I'll end my comments there. I understand the concern. I think I've learned a lot in 3 months regarding the Princeton community about its commitment to doing things. And then the question is, how do we do it right? And how do we gain the trust of the community? Because that's really the most important thing. And how do we respect our students? And how do we get them to understand that their opinion, their perspective is really the most important in our school district, because they're our clients. That's who we serve. That's who we want to be the next group of people who are leaders. And we have to demonstrate and earn that respect.
Thank you so much. Yes, Shirley, and then I think we will move on from there into the next portion of the discussion.
Yes, I was thinking when Geoffrey said how many people are paying attention, and we talk about progressive schools, when we talk about housing and lack of resources and economics as barriers, I look through all of the people here, and unless I don't know telephone numbers, I only see one person in my neighborhood. And I'm really concerned that when we talk about education and we talk about equity, that the people in this neighborhood we don't see. And it could have a lot to do with our history. You know, these are the people who lived through the segregation and their descendants. But unless we want to talk about equity and equality, we have to have the people in this neighborhood to participate and to remember their history.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for bringing that up. That's a really, really excellent point to end this portion of the discussion. I did want to very quickly say, on sort of while wrapping this up on this note, that I do know that there was a little bit of discussion about lack of communication of some of the efforts that are going on. And for instance, I don't know if everyone's necessarily aware, but there was, for instance, a restorative circle that was held after the particular incident that we brought up, the video incident. I think a lot of people in our community maybe were not aware that that happened. And so I think that's a really, really important point, just echoing something that someone else said in this discussion. But I would like to move on. I think our next question should be, in the 2018 Princeton Public Schools Equity Audit Report, one of the findings is that the district's, quote, competitive pressure will dilute or undermine educational equity efforts if those efforts are viewed as detrimental to individual goals. So do you think that the competitive environment of Princeton is a barrier to educational equity? And if so, what can be done to address this? Juan, go ahead. Start us off.
I personally don't think that it's a barrier, but the thing that I will say is that the fact that Princeton Public School System is positioned right next to Princeton University, and there still hasn't been a massive scale mentorship program from students at the university and at the Princeton Public School System, I think it's a little bit concerning that the administration hasn't been doing this. And I'm not particularly pointing any fingers, but over the past, 5-10 years, like I think this town is particularly privileged because we have a university that's not even a mile away from Princeton High School and that can offer so many resources, one of them including the Princeton University Preparatory Program that identifies low-income, first-generation students who throughout middle school and high school are provided mentorship. And so for me, it's not a question of, is the fact that Princeton High School is so competitive detrimental to minority students? To me is, why aren't our minority students that feel that they're disenfranchised not being connected to one of the wealthiest institutions in this country, which is Princeton University? And I know, there's multiple pipelines. Corner House has an incredible mentorship program. There's the Big Brother Big Sister that I think only has like 15 kids in high school, and then they identify 15 kids who might be at risk. But apart from that, I don't think there's a true partnership with the university and the many resources. And I'm sure, the Princeton University students are super energetic, and they would be the first, if someone reached out to them saying that do you want to be a mentor to someone who's at risk, I can guarantee you that a lot of them are going to show up. And so the fact that, there's still no massive scale mentorship program, I think it's a little bit embarrassing, to tell you the truth. I think it's, the leadership hasn't identified our competitive advantage in terms of cutting the achievement gap, which is that we have one of the top universities here right next to us. And to me, it seems like the only partnership that there is AP classes that are offered. And we all know who that benefits. So I'll leave it at that.
It's a great idea.
Geoffrey, go ahead.
On that university part, see, the thing is, I actually remember from MSTAN being recommended programs from the university, as well as my cousin who was living with me for a while. And a lot of those programs you actually have to reach out yourself for. I remember there was a time when I seeked out SAT prep, and that is something that makes me wonder how come other students don't know about this, and how come because I didn't have those connections that I wouldn't have known? That's another point to add there. So that's a really good point, Juan. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to speak to either the conversation that Juan started or sort of go back to the original question?
I actually love the proposal that Juan mentioned with the Princeton Children's Fund. I think there's, opportunities to have community partners help with things like this too. But I love the idea, and I'm thinking in similar terms, but with the younger kids. So I love that. I did want to mention, I didn't like the way the question was formulated, because I do think there should be high expectations for all students. And, when it comes to these kinds of equity initiatives, the more successful ones are when there's the late civil rights scholar Derek Bell called interest convergence. And I think that parents can unify over a shared commitment to a strong curriculum for all students. And students, I think in Princeton, would benefit from changes to the elementary curriculum to use some well-known, content-rich ELA curriculum that bring in more history, bring in more science, extend learning time through the day. And I think it would benefit all kids. So those are the kinds of things where there might not be an opposition between, academically ambitious parents and all parents, who just want great education for their kids. I think everyone wants that. And there's, I didn't think the question made sense to me, because everyone is ambitious for their kids. I haven't met a parent yet who's not ambitious for their kids.
Marceline?
I just want to clarify the quote because I wrote it. So what happened during the audit was we did a number of focus groups, surveys, etc. Not necessarily looking for this like internal competition that was happening. We were looking for other things, and it kept coming out louder and louder and louder. And it came in parent tables, it came in student focus groups, it came in teacher focus groups. And so what it's describing is not the idea that high expectations are in competition with equity, nor is it describing the idea that we shouldn't be connecting students with excellent opportunities. What it was describing is this internal competition that seems to be there, that may be an external expectation and pressure that's happening, like I need to get to this top school, and in order to get there, I need all of these top courses, and the school having limited resources, then in turn, what I was hearing was catering to the students and families that wanted certain courses and not necessarily meeting the broad needs of all learners. And that was a threat to equity inside the school. So I just want to clarify, not to assume that the sentence was at all saying that high expectations are an issue, nor was it saying that we don't want to connect students with wonderful opportunities and pathways. It was saying there's something that's going on inside that's causing decisions to be made that threaten equity. So that's just a point of clarification.
Well, the idea would be when they get to high school, everyone would be in a position to benefit from rigorous AP classes. So there wouldn't be a competition in that sense, because there would be the groundwork laid earlier.
Well, that assumes, and which is very present in the Princeton culture, at least what I picked up on, that assumes everybody wants to take AP classes, or everybody, students, learners, humans come to education with different purposes, and ideas, and certain purposes are taking elevated priority, and others are getting kind of drowned out, which therefore then drowns out certain interests or things that students might be like tremendously talented at. So.
Can I just make a comment? I thought your idea with regard to the mentorship at Princeton University is outstanding. I wanted to mention that we had planned, this was done by Steve before he left, We had hoped to have about 200 or 300 Princeton University students work with our youngsters when we started this school this fall to support our new learning management system, Canvas, because Princeton University uses Canvas. So unfortunately, with the pandemic, I think we're down to about 30 mentors that we're going to have work with our kids, but we really thought that we were going to have about 300. But unfortunately, that happened, and we weren't able to get the students. But I'm sure that can happen as we move to January and maybe the pandemic subsides a bit. But I want to go back to the opportunity gap, as Lynda mentioned. I don't know if everyone wants to take an AP course, but in my opinion, Princeton does not have the number of students that we should just leave identified, and we shouldn't put in supports at individual buildings so that every youngster has an opportunity to make that choice. I think what occurs now in the middle school and the high school is, I'm talking to some parents, kids are not able to take the courses that maybe they're interested in because they weren't ready. And that's one of the reasons why I've asked the elementary principals to put in these measurable objectives on how we're going to help our kids and how we're going to build those supports. To me, that's critical, because we want to give kids opportunities to achieve to whatever the optimum of their abilities are. And without that foundation, they're not going to get there. So I love the mentorship idea. I thought that was an absolute winner for us, because our youngsters would have been able to have, the way the program is going to work, there's going to be 2 students for every family. Not only would they be able to support the kids, how about the parents who need help in navigating some of the websites and navigating some of the work that's being done? That was the plan. But I thank you for that other suggestion, because from a mentorship at Princeton University, I think that's something the high school administration and junior high administration really ought to look at, because you're right, it's an unbelievable resource right here in Princeton. So, but I did wanted to mention about the opportunity gap and the reason why I think that's so important to develop over the period of time, and to really have measurable objectives. When's the last time we identified youngsters and we're able to see what progress was made? Princeton still, with your latest report, 50% of African-American students are classified, 40% of Hispanic students are. That's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. I watched in Winslow Township, which has about a 70% minority population, change our curriculum to thematic and problem-solving curriculum instead of a traditional European curriculum, and in 3 years reduced the number of kids who were classified by 30%. So what I'm saying to you is, I think we need to take a look at how we deliver the instruction. Is it, I heard students say earlier, oh, I'd love to see it revamped to where we're talking about hip hop or whatever it is, but that's contemporary problem solving. That's not new. It's thematic instruction. It's getting kids engaged by teaching standards through things that are important to them. Issues like race, issues like economic power and equity. So I just mentioned that because I think it's important. At some point, we want kids to be able to make choices, and kids need to be prepared, and we have a responsibility to build those supports. And kids will have those opportunities if we do it well.
Okay, Eli, go ahead. Oh, okay. You're unmuted now.
Yeah, my mic's been having trouble, so. One thing I wanted to say in regards to the achievement issue is, I think Lynda was saying that every student should have the ability to do APs if we make the elementary schools and everything, prepare them for it. But I think one of the issues is that's disregarding the so many students who have the opportunities for their parents to get them extra tutoring outside of school, and that almost like an economic opportunity gap between the students that will succeed the most, quote unquote, they'll get like the highest grades, might be the students who've taken so many extra classes, while other students who might be really, really interested and really want to succeed might see themselves do worse just because they didn't have those opportunities. And that competition between the students definitely causes a very unhealthy climate with mental health, especially, where you might be trying your hardest, but you might not be succeeding, quote unquote, as much as your fellow classmates are.
Okay, Shirley, I think you had your hand up. I'm so sorry. I didn't see that initially.
That's okay. When we talk about mentoring, we don't have to just go to the university. We can get people in the community. I started a program called Pulse at Princeton High School in 1994. And other than being one of the best clubs in the school, we also had mentors in the community. So if they were interested in education, I had someone to work with them who was a teacher. If they were interested in government, Michelle Tuck Ponder at that time was a mayor, so they followed her for a year. If they were interested in science, there was someone in science and health and theater. Emily Mann at McCarter worked with 3 of the girls who were interested in theater. Actually, one of them actually became an actress. But if you get people in the community who have certain skills and professions and have students work with them, that's another way of mentoring.
Yes, Keith, go ahead.
First, I wanted to say, Juan, that I thought that was a really wonderful idea. I think a lot of Princeton students, they think of Trenton first as a place to volunteer and to engage with these kinds of questions. And I don't think they necessarily think that there's a subset of students in Princeton, in the hometown, that could benefit. And if anything that the school system could do to develop that relationship would be, I think, great and meaningful. I do think that there is a problem in any kind of competitive, hyper-competitive educational climate like the Princeton University or Princeton High School, where there's a kind of a race to the top mentality for a significant subset of the students, and that draws resources. And it means that it always has some kind of detrimental impact, whether it's on the mental health of students, whether it's on the feelings of inadequacy because you haven't made it to the top. And I think a lot of it has to do with a narrow sense of achievement that comes when you think that, you know, there are only like 4 pathways to excellence in your curriculum. So unless you're taking AP courses, you're less than, and unless you get into these and so I think that for me, it's not so much, it's broadening the sense of what academic achievement looks like. And that means, like I said, things like, you know, creative writing or the art courses, and really upholding those as real, you know, spotlighting them as achievement in the same way that we tend to sort of say that only specific kinds of academic achievement really qualify as excellence. So it's more of a general comment, but I definitely do think that, you know, from dealing with my own kids and their friends, that there is a cost to this kind of hyper competitiveness. And so how do you lower the cost while also, I mean, I certainly also believe that opening up AP classes and opening up classes so you include more students in them is also a step that needs to be taken.
Okay, and really quickly, I will call on you, Geoffrey. I just wanted to let you know I did get a comment in the chat from a Princeton High School teacher. Just an FYI, I did try to set up a mentorship program between the Princeton University Computer Science Department. The former Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources would not allow it because all Princeton University students would have to have background checks in order to be in the school. So I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know if that changes its context in a virtual learning setting or in this current environment, but I just wanted to let you know because I thought that was a helpful comment from the chat. Go ahead, Geoffrey, please.
Well, first, I just want to keep it on tangent now. I got to ask, why is that an issue to have background checks? I, as a student at a college in Ohio, I had to take background checks to do work study, and I know many people in the education department who are studying there do background checks.
I can answer that if you'd like, Grace, but the background checks are necessary for any volunteer. But that shouldn't be a hindrance into setting up a program, because we can easily, we can easily do them, and we have paid for them for volunteers to come into the school. So that shouldn't be an issue for that program to be set up. I mean, that's a minor obstacle. And if the teacher really wants to do that, I would encourage them to meet with the principal and call me. I would think that if that's a possibility, a background check shouldn't be a hindrance to us developing that kind of relationship.
So I mean, I don't know, obviously, the full situation. There might have been, I think it sounds like there might have been some complications, not just with the Princeton Public Schools, but also with Princeton University. I just wanted to bring that up because it was a discussion. I don't know the exact details, but it's obviously a great idea.
Yeah, and to that point, all the volunteers that I talked about from Princeton University do have to have background checks to work with our youngsters. That's state law, so we're not able to not follow that. But there's no reason why the board, if it thought it was an appropriate program, couldn't fund those particular background checks. We have done that for other volunteer programs.
Okay, perfect. Is there anyone else who wants to quickly jump in on this question? I think it would make sense to move on to another question quickly. And I do want to remind everyone, if they have any other questions that they'd like to submit, they can just submit it through the chat and let us know, because we are sort of reaching that point in our discussion. So I think that a good question for us to do now is if we could talk briefly about what is the role of students in creating a racially progressive school versus what is the role of parents, what is the role of the broader community. I don't know if there are particular people who want to discuss particular portions of that, but I think it's a nice question to sort of go to next. Would anyone like to begin?
I'll just indicate that the Board of Education has authorized a 9-member committee to rename the Princeton United Middle School. The renaming is a minor part of that, because what the intent is to make it all-inclusive. And Principal Burr is working with students and staff and the senior high school students, because we want and he's going to be presenting his framework on October 12th to our organizing committee. But the reality is that we would want this program to be so ingrained in the school community that we want it to be student-led. And the question becomes, how do we do that? And he and his staff are working with students and the senior high school administration to come up with an educational plan that they'll present to our planning committee. In addition to that, Mrs. Satterfield, who is also on that committee, is working on the historical aspects so that it becomes more than renaming. It becomes part of a broader conversation about race and about history. And Dr. Joy Barnes made a suggestion at one of the community meetings that we held as a Board of Education, which our planning committee has embraced already. I believe it'll be part of this education. She recommended that maybe we start naming hallways in our schools, so that kids, when they're walking around, it's like a living history of what Princeton is, or what the national perspective is on various issues. So I wanted to point that out because I think it's germane to this question, in the sense that students will have a significant role in this process, because we want them to be engaging with the community. We think that's the learning opportunity here. That's an opportunity to have a conversation that moves. Renaming is important, but it should be it should be a jumping off point for a broader discussion and how we encompass and engage the entire community for probably a 6-month period of time, and make it a real learning experience, pre-K to 12 and community-wide.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to jump in for this question? Dr. BJ, was that a hand, or? All right, let me unmute you. I'm so sorry.
No worries. So I think the critical idea here, and thank you, Dr. Galasso. We talk about mentors as if there's only one type of mentor. The key to, I think, a powerful identity formation around anti-racism is that you have mentors everywhere, that in every class there are opportunities to learn more and more about how to just be an equalizing force, how to have agency. So if we had a Septima Clark Hall, we could balance that with to UU Hall or whatever, so that we represent a diversity of voices and perspectives, and that children lead the reality, that we design programs that students see themselves, whatever flavor they exist in life, whatever they choose to present openly or not so openly, that we take programs like Pulse and MSAN, we take programs like the phenomenal Asian Festival, we allow programs that happens every year, we allow programs like the Latino Heritage Month, whether it be a concert or a film festival, we allow these things to sort of thrive and be a part of our experience, where we hold folks accountable to sort of seeing each other. A lot of that will deal with people like Cecilia or members from multiracial communities to feel like they are being seen. So I think that's the kind of bravery that we need to embrace. And so I know we're nearing the end. It's been a very long day. So I wanted to jump in. I don't know where this is on the course, but I wanted to talk about representation and what having a bigger cohort of teachers and educational leaders that are teachers and leaders of color. We can take the Juans of our school, the Eli's of our school, the Mojis of our school who are in high school, support them and encourage them to come back to be educators in the space, for example. Provide opportunities for them to hone their skills, whether it be in policy development or education or technology. They have paid, oh, Brianna, I forgot you on here, my bad, have paid opportunities to come and be agents of change in our schools while they're students, after they graduate, and so on, so that we sort of build the leaders that we need. I appreciate that Mike Volpe is trying to take those of us who are teachers of color with credentials to become leaders of change, because I mean, so much is here. So much is here. We often go outside of our district when there is excellence and brilliance and expertise in our classrooms that just needs to be reproduced. But frankly, in a pandemic, or whether before the pandemic, the challenges of being all of that in this space is hard because we commit to being excellent teachers. And so being an excellent teacher often means that it's difficult to go outside of that. So I wanted to just take a moment to talk about two things. I think about the Black Educators Alliance. It's about coalition building. It's about telling the Geoffreys about programs that they may not have known at the university exists in science, where maybe they didn't see themselves as a science person, but after having access to programs outside of the high school, they say, oh, wow, I could do that. Yeah, because it doesn't, your identity as in this competitive environment can get shaded. And so I frankly feel like students in our district get lost with all the opportunities, perhaps. And so they don't even know how to be, because we uphold whiteness in a way that is a little bit unhealthy as we pursue these competitive meritorious titles. And so we got the Pearl, which is a Princeton Introduction to Racial Literacy. There is a large request that we have a required racial literacy program for students. Any student that plans to be a leader in our high school will have to take this class, and that's going to start like this year. The idea that we have team captains who, because of their commitment to the sport or because of who they identify front facing, they don't want to take a racial literacy elective because it doesn't have the same status. Well, we're trying to create opportunities for them to take that, be leaders, be better in terms of how they commit to social justice. And instead, as an alternative to the AP route, we allow them to sort of build a program for themselves where they can now be a part of a research program. In the same way, like at the Regents in New York, you have a badge that says you completed this program, you did a real study. And so you get out there and you be excellent. If you want to do a vocational or you wanted to do the traditional track, you have opportunities to do it in a way that is going to attend and be attendant to all of these intersections. So I think we're on our way. I appreciate that Keisha and her team, Keisha Smith-Carrington and her team is creating programs for us as a district to have teachers who get on the same page with the language. And so the key, I think there's a lot of work being done, and it's a lot, right? Because it feels like all of the balls are thrown in the air at the same time. And we're trying to catch them. And I think the commitment on the part of the district has been genuine. And so I appreciate Dr. Galasso. I appreciate Lynda Dodd, because the Princeton Children's Fund has been supportive. And so it's exciting and terrifying at the same time, because once you know something, you have to be accountable to that thing. And so no longer will it be okay that we do so much damage in our classrooms and in our buildings. And so, yeah, it's here. And then the last thing I'll say is that I also think racially progressive schools need to create and be okay with Black and brown children siloing themselves, caucusing themselves, and building their cultural norms, whether it be their history. We have all kinds of programs for Chinese students to learn Chinese language and culture on a Saturday. We have programs for people to learn Jewish culture and experience on a weekend. Well, perhaps that's the thing, and it needs to be created. And so there are opportunities for that to happen too. And I think that's the safe place that's missing, that will allow us to grow stronger. And I hope we're okay with that. I hope we're okay with that.
Thank you so much, Dr. BJ. I do know, obviously, that we're sort of ending. I think the thought is that we probably will end this discussion around 9. Does anyone else want to jump onto that? And then we can maybe do one more audience question and then wrap up. Is there anyone else who wanted to jump in for this, or can we move on to?
Can I just make one more plug for racial equity impact assessments? Because I do think that there's so much going on. Many people care, but there are blind spots along the way. And if those can be used at every level, even PTOs, I think that, these moments where there's exclusion because of lack of access to tutoring or to extracurricular activities, the problem can be identified. And, systematically, there can be resources adjusted to address that. So opportunity gaps have to be continually identified. So this, I think, impact assessment process can help going forward. I think everyone's on the same page. There's good faith efforts, but this is a structure to make sure that you're uncovering things that you might have missed. So.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to very quickly, we did get a few audience questions. So I'm hoping that this doesn't become too repetitive, but there did seem to be a lot of interest in sort of questions about opportunity gaps. So I'm going to try my best. There was one question specifically for the students on the call. What suggestions do you have for Dr. Galasso and the elementary schools to essentially reduce the opportunity gap? And then there was also some discussion about just a lot of questions about opportunities, and someone brought up sort of the DLI program as sort of an effort to close the opportunity gap at Princeton Public Schools, and looking into how that goal is being met and which families are being served. So I'm sort of putting all these together because they're sort of all around the opportunity gap. If anyone wants to put in sort of some last words about that and what suggestions they have for how we can address that moving forward. I think that's a good combining of our audience questions. Yes, Brianna.
I'm unmuted. I would say one thing with elementary children, and this can apply to like all of them, is really the curriculum that we have that we're hoping to change is very like European centered. And I think one of the things is like we always, and also the issue with America is that we see ourselves as a melting pot. And I think one of those things is really enforced through our education system is that students feel the need to lose certain parts of their culture, of who they are, things that there are like traditions or whatever. And I think it's really important for schools to really be there to like embrace them and really show them and have children really care and just be proud of their differences and really celebrate that. So that's just something I thought I'd mention.
Yes,
also, that has to do a lot with English language learners, because a lot of times teachers really promote them speaking English and prefer them to lose their second or third language or their first or second languages. And that really is actually very detrimental to their education and their growth as a person in the long run.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Brianna. Jeffrey, did you have a hand up or?
Yeah, I actually changed my mind. Sorry.
No worries. Yes, Dr. Birge. No. Yes. Should be fixed now.
So I'm so glad you said that, Brianna, because the reality is taking a literacy approach in the elementary schools hopefully will address that. There is this beautiful diversity of books that allow for own voices stories. So they are typically written by authors of diverse languages and representations, to get back to Marceline's initial point. The idea that we represent stories that are narratives, but are counter narratives to some of that will allow more students to see themselves, right? And so it's exciting. I think that the libraries are doing a fantastic job at helping us to get there. To Eli's point, they mentioned how in a district right across the road, cultural celebration was there. That's the core. That's the core. But at the same time, you can be respectful that dominant skills dominate. And so competition where everyone sees themselves again, it's a beautiful thing. So taking a literary approach to racial literacy, I think is going to be delightful and will give everyone the same kind of language. So hopeful.
Does anyone else want to jump in for this question? Yes, Eli?
I think definitely another way to close, I guess you can't really close it completely without, I don't know, it's very complicated. But one way is to have teachers or administrators and role models that reflect the identities in the student body. Speaking to my experience as a non-binary person, I've never had a transgender teacher. I've never even seen one in schools, the ones I've been in. And I know how impactful that would have been for me to see myself reflected in a teacher, to feel like I truly had somebody who would understand my experience. And I think that goes for all marginalized communities, how impactful it is to have somebody that you can know right away that they understand you.
Okay. Jeffrey?
Yeah, that's a very important point. Dr. Birge mentioned this earlier, and someone else mentioned this even earlier, that really diversity in staff is something that should not be ignored in a hope to have a more equitable environment for opportunity, because those people are people that we look up to. For one, personally speaking, I really did look up to like Dr. Birge when I took chemistry with her. as a sophomore, and it really did help, like having a familiar face to my community. And I feel like that's a really underrated part about Princeton High School. There's a lot that I can be grateful for, but I feel like definitely the staff also needs to be as diverse as the education as we're learning.
Yes, I was just thinking, Dr. Galasso, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to make one comment. I think the student comments are really very helpful. And one of the things I would recommend to you, I've always had success with having increased a number of people of color who have taught in the district that I was superintendent by utilizing the community as people who would be recruiters for me. You all have friends, you have colleagues, you have associates that are graduating colleges and universities. Please have them apply to the Princeton School District. The assistant superintendent and the board its focus now is to hire various cultures in our school to represent the student population. So I would implore you to be recruiters for the Princeton School District. You will see a faster and quicker movement in that direction if you all assist us in doing that. I've done it with ministers, I've done it with community groups and key communicators, and the people that they have recommended to us have helped us achieve goals. So I think it's important for all of you. How can students be impactful? You have connections, brothers, sisters, cousins who are in colleges and universities, who may be graduating with education degrees, or who may want to go alternate route to the educational process. Please be a recruiter for the Princeton school system so that we can meet the goals. And all of a sudden, Eli and others are going to see people who are teaching in classrooms that look like them and represent them. So I would suggest that to you. I don't know if you've thought of that in the past, but it's been a tried and true method of recruiting people of color in various school districts, because they have to feel welcome. And if you are recruiters and you're talking about Princeton schools, there's a good opportunity for us to have that individual become a teacher in the school district.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And then I think we're going to go to closing.
I hope it works this time, Dr. Galasso, because I know that we had two wonderful residents in Princeton. One who is a guidance counselor now in New Orleans, who would have been excellent here in Princeton, and one who is teaching now in Trenton. And our homegrown people have tried to be in the school system, and it never worked for them. And when I was at the high school, I was one of the recruiters who went to colleges, and we would have them come back and we would welcome them, and not one of them was accepted. So it has worked, it has happened, it never worked. So I hope it works this time.
Well, I can only commit to the time that I'm here, Shirley, but if you...
No, I know you'll do it. You'll do it. I'm just saying it'll get better.
Yeah, and you know, you told me that story before, and that's a sad story because you had the resources.
We lost a lot of our people here.
Correct, and it didn't work, but I have seen it work, and the district is committed. The assistant superintendent, who's going to be here for 10 years, is committed. So I believe that if we put the effort in, that you will see the results in a very short period of time.
I'm sure.
All right, I think that was a perfect note to end this discussion on. Thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion, for participating. I know it was a long time, but it was like, you were amazing. This panel discussion was amazing. I think I can speak for everyone here when I say that. And thank you everyone who joined us. I know that we were competing with the Princeton Unified Middle School Back to School Night, and so I'm really honored that we won out in certain cases. And for those who cannot make it, this is being recorded, and I believe that it will be posted on the Not in Our Town Princeton website, as well as potentially the Princeton Public Library site. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So yes, thank you all so much for coming to this discussion. And Thank you for being willing to engage in this discussion. And just one last reminder before everyone goes, that obviously voting is very, very important. Ballots are supposed to be coming out this week. Please, please, please fill out your mail-in ballots as soon as you get it and submit them as early as possible. It is so important. If you have not registered, October 13th is the deadline in New Jersey. So please, please register. And thank you all so much for joining this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.